The Tragic History of the Military Press, Olympic and World Championship Competition, 1928 to 1972, by John D. Fair, August 29th, 2011. Part 3. Therefore, contrary to his previous criticisms about Russian presses, he began to condone a relaxation of standards. In a Strength and Health article, he focused on Vorobiev as the greatest exponent of the push press at Melbourne. His knees jerked in every press, but he did it smoothly and got away with it, as he walked back and forth, waiting for the record to be weighed. He grinned like the cat who had eaten the canary to note that he got away with the push press. American lifters will have to become better push pressers to get their presses higher. Although this advice was preferred as training information, accompanied by a description of how to perform the push press, the implication was that American lifters should do whatever necessary to win. Indeed, at Warsaw in 1959, he offered the opinion that Jim Bradford tries to press too perfectly. These views raised doubts about the recent trend towards strict pressing. At the 1960 Olympics in Rome, Hoffman had no cause for complaint about high standards. Vinci, still backbending, had all of his presses passed on his way to a gold medal. In the middleweights, when Kono got 2 red lights on his 309-pound press, a near riot resulted among the audience. Soon, according to Rader, soldiers were brought in and stationed around the auditorium. Meanwhile, Hoffman protested the decision, and the jury of appeal passed Kono's lift. In the mid-heavyweights, John Pulskamp, America's worst backbender, was credited for all 3 presses, while British rival Lewis Martin, with a much stricter style, could manage only 2. After Pulskamp succeeded with his first attempt of 292 pounds, Oscar State concluded that the backbend he was using would get bigger and worse with the heavier weights. It did, but the refereeing in this class was by no means as strict as it was in the previous classes, and this leniency was Pulskamp's good fortune. Martin's second try, with 303 pounds, went a lot slower, but he managed to finish it in his usual immaculate style that was such a contrast to Pulskamp's doubtful laid-back technique. Now, Pulskamp essayed 303, and this attempt should not have passed, but pass it did. Martin called for 308.5, but it was too much for him. It went up only a few inches. Pulskamp took the same weight and made it thanks to lax judging. Although State concedes that the victorious Russians in that class, Vorobiev and Lomakin, took their share of liberties, it would have been difficult for Hoffman to maintain that his lifters were treated less fairly than their Iron Curtain rivals, or that the Russian victory was politically contrived. By this time, however, what was becoming known as the Olympic press, though still called the Russian press, was being practiced by virtually all nations. This technique, along with the proliferation of steroids and nationalized sports programs, enabled Poland, Hungary, and Japan to join Russia and the United States as major weightlifting powers. Press figures soared in the early 1960s. Officials at World Championships in Vienna in 1961 and Budapest in 1962 were inundated with controversial presses, some of the most extreme coming from Hungarians Irma Foldi and Győző Verres. But it was the pressing of Russian light heavyweight Rudolf Ploegfelder and lax officiating at Vienna that again nearly caused a riot. In his encounter with Kono, Ploegfelder pressed 308 and 319 pounds with a considerable knee kick and backbend. When Kono, though hardly Simon Pure, was turned down with 319 pounds, the whole vast stadium erupted in a storm of booing, whistling, shouting, catcalling, and even fist waving. It was the loudest and longest demonstration of the kind announcer State had ever heard. But the noise became even louder and more menacing when the jury of appeal turned the Americans' appeal against this decision down. The hubbub lasted for 20 minutes. What so upset the spectators was not so much the rejection of Kono's lift, but the passing of Ploegfelder's far less strict press, which gave the Russian an unfair advantage. When Ploegfelder made his third attempt with 330 pounds amid a frightful din, and with the most obvious knee kick of all, the jury removed all three offending judges. Hoffman was furious with both officials and jury. "You can't win," he lamented. At Budapest, Hoffman claimed that America was robbed of 2 gold medals by careless and dishonest officials. Repeatedly in the featherweight class, the 2 judges turned down Western lifters and passed lifts for Eastern lifters. Russian Evgenij Minayev's pressing was so bad that people howled and whistled every time he came out after that. But it was in the light heavyweight and the mid-heavy classes that Kono and Norbert Szymanski lost to communist adversaries on questionable calls. As a result, despite his criticisms of Eastern Bloc lifters and lax officiating, Hoffman became reconciled to the pressing style that had become so popular since the Rome Olympics, which he wrongly attributed to the Russians. He now publicized this 4-step process of lean back, push forward, lean back, and press out, arguing that a lifter who presses without sin cannot hold a world record. But he further moralized that unlike his communist adversaries who performed a jerk press, Americans like upcoming heavyweight Tony Garcia were pressing within the rules. Indeed, it is not the intention of officials in this country to pass jerk presses, so the American version of the Olympic press became the Garcia press, and more than ever Hoffman reiterated his refrain that if you want to beat the Russians, you must train like the Russians. By this time, other international coaches were better able to analyze the new press and rule infractions through the Spectre Analyzer, a special camera that recorded 5 times as slow as slow motion. Prior to the Budapest Championships, Webster had shown motion pictures spotlighting doubtful pressing techniques, and officials publicly announced that they were going to interpret the rules strictly. Sure enough, observed British coach Al Murray, the rules for the press were interpreted strictly for the poor bantamweights, and lifts were ruled out one after another. But, as usual, by the time the heavier classes got into action, the officials had begun once again to be impressed by how easily, meaning fast, the heavy iron was flying up and the officiating pressure was off. When the light heavyweights were lifting, officiating was about to back to normal. When the light heavyweights were lifting, officiating was about back to normal, and just about anything that went up was good. FIHC President Clarence Johnson bemoaned this state of affairs and even held a session on press problems at the International Coaching Conference in Munich, but no one had any solutions. Hoffman, whose lifters were employing the Olympic press but still losing to the communists, was convinced that international politics was the culprit. After the 1963 championships in Stockholm, he complained that it was hard enough to get fair decisions from the officials, but invariably the jury reverses the decision when it suits their convenience, which is any time that a man from the Iron Curtain countries is involved. Through chair of the jury, Johnson was always outvoted, 4-1, by members from Russia, Poland, Finland, and Egypt, in favor of lifters from socialist countries. State, as press purist, was appalled by jury reversals favoring light heavyweight Podfelker, Russian, and mid-heavy Irenaeus Polinsky, Polish. But it was the Olympic press of Verres of Hungary that attracted the most criticism. According to the pundit Jim Murray, Verres employed a kick to get the bar moving, firing the weight upward with a bow-like or slingshot-like action. Then, after the barbell is about 3/4 up, he bends back away from the weight again as he straightens his arms. For those who would consider this a horrible style, Murray reminded readers that Verres does not, after all, referee his own lifting. So incensed was Hoffman at the state of affairs that at a 1964 coaches conference in Paris, he proposed that juries should replace referees, but not reverse their decisions, and that the press be eliminated. At the ensuing FHI, formerly FIHC meeting at the Tokyo Olympics, Hoffman's proposition on juries passed. Significantly, it was introduced by a Czechoslovakian delegate. Even more surprisingly, Hoffman voted with the Russian delegate to retain the press. He rationalized that there were not enough votes for abolition. We will have to live with the press, for it has been a part of weightlifting too long to drop it. Officials will simply have to do a better job of ruling out infractions, notably exaggerated knee kicks. Even more indicative of a thaw in East-West relations with the support of some communist countries in Clarence Johnson's re-election to the FHI presidency. Although press violations abounded at Tokyo and press figures climbed higher than ever, a hint of change was evident at the 1965 European Championships in Sofia. Officials, liberated from the meddlings of the jury, exhibited a born-again strictness to the extent of applying a 27-degree backbend rule. This approach carried over to the 1965 World Championships in Tehran. After Olympic bantamweight champion Alexei Vakunin failed all 3 press attempts, Webster pronounced the refereeing the toughest I've ever seen. Featherweight press failures were 60%, though knee kicks and standing bench presses were more evident in the heavier classes. This strictness continued at the 1966 World Championships in East Berlin. In the middleweights, Hoffman noted, the officials were very rough, passing only 13 of 33 lifts in the evening, thus effectively eliminating American press specialist Russ Knipp from medal contention. More significant, however, was a general breakup of communist bloc solidarity. At Tehran, Shatov, now one of the greatest exponents of strictness, contributed his share of red lights to eliminating press world record holder Hiroshi Fukuda and Janos Benedict of Hungary, and to lessening the fortunes of Rudolf Kozlowski, practitioner of a new and even slicker form of the Olympic press dubbed the Polish press. In the middleweights, State observed that the absence of a politically biased jury prevented the Russian Viktor Kuznetsov benefiting from a huge back lean and the blatant partiality of a fellow Russian referee. Lack of communist unity was most evident in the light heavyweights, as East Berlin, where the Russian Vladimir Belyaev and Hungarian Verres were contending for the gold medal. Hoffman recorded that Verres' press of 358 was as good as any made in the championships, and the Russian and the Polish officials gave him a red light. Vorobiev, the Russian coach, stood with folded arms glaring at the Polish judge as he was about to render his decision, and no doubt this influenced him, for up came a red light, and Verres lost the championships. Still, the problems with the press, especially the disparity in judging between lighter and heavier classes, were unresolved. A more extreme solution took the form of increased calls by iron game purists, with no political agendas or axes to grind. for abolition of the press. Foremost of these proponents was Peary Rader. Peary Rader. He was incensed by slow-motion films of Polish-style lifters Waldemar Bazanowski and Norbert Ozemek making world record presses with knee kicks and excessive backbends with the approval and good wishes of the blind officials. Rader insists that some lifters employ less knee bend in the jerk than was now permitted in the press. In some instances, there was no sign of pressing, leading him to conjecture sarcastically that soon we will be making a new rule against a press out to finish a two-arm press. Current presses were being done like a flash. We try to blame the officials, but actually the lifters have practiced and perfected this to such an extent that it is next to impossible for the official to see what is happening, especially the chief referee in front. He knows there is something wrong, but he isn't certain what it is. How then can we classify this press as anything but subterfuge, trickery, or deliberate falsification of pressing style? The whole pressing situation is in an almost impossible mess. When talk of making the press more strict is heard, then the lifters complain that if this is done, they will never be able to make a new record, as they cannot possibly press such poundages in good strict style. This is true, so what is to be done? Allow the press to deteriorate further? It seems the only solution now is to discard the press entirely from the Olympics and maintain the snatch and clean and jerk, two athletic lifts that are not too difficult to officiate and will give a full measure of a man's overall strength and athletic ability. Rader also makes the valid observation that the power lifts were increasingly gaining respect as truer indicators of strength than the press, which was coming to be regarded as a strongman stunt. Virginia lifting chairman Bob Christ called it the two hands clean and convulsion. Much of the excitement generated by the new Polish press stemmed from Poland's upset victory over the Russians at Tehran. Suddenly, how to do it articles appeared, ironically sometimes by the same authorities who were advocating stricter standards. Interestingly, a return to the military press was also being advocated by some lifters as a training exercise for the Olympic press. Former world record holder Bill March recommended that beginners learn to press strict and also learn a good loose style. Then, depending on who the officials are, you will be able to press as the judges dictate. A more amoral view was expressed by bodybuilding promoter Joe Weider, still trying to keep a hand in weightlifting. He believed that if you want to compete with the big boys, you have to lift like them. Put so-called moral considerations aside. In sports, there is no point handicapping yourself with worry over a rule book. Weider's views closely coincided with those of the Anything Goes school, which advocated abolishing the rules and permitting lifters any technique to press the weight overhead. The medley of contradictory forces that had been mounting for a decade converged at the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. After the lax officiating at the so-called Little Olympics in 1967, lifters were in no way prepared for the strictness of the following year. Judging on the press was extremely strict, observed Hoffman. Knee kicking of any degree was taboo. He attributed the poor showing of his team in good part to almost impossible strictness in the press judging. Rader concurred, noting that lifters seemed shocked, disillusioned, disappointed, and perhaps a little despondent at having to start so low in the press and still failing. In many cases, there were more presses lost than made, and even the heavyweights were strictly officiated. But not all of it was strict. State pointed out that the standard of refereeing sagged badly in the lightweight class, where the chief referee in particular, Bob Hoffman of the USA, was far too lenient. It was so inconsistent in the middleweight and mid-heavy classes that the jury recommended a change of officials. When FHI President Johnson refused to do so in the former, which included Hoffman's lawyer and crony David Matlin, two jury members, Wally Holland of England and Jean Dame of France, resigned. That the shortcomings of Hoffman and his allies were reported in a rival publication provides some grounds for suspicion as to their authenticity. Enough evidence exists, however, to suggest that Americans were out of step with the high standards set at Mexico City. Most seriously, there was a long and heated debate by the FHI over a proposal by Dame to abolish the press, which he called a festering sore in the body of weightlifting. Delegates narrowly voted to retain it by 27 to 23, but Webster heard many comments that this lift should be removed from the competitions. How much longer can this continue? I say the situation is now beyond rectification. Over the next year, it became obvious that too much momentum had built up for the permissiveness for too many decades for the strict standards applied at Mexico City to hold. Webster pointed out magazine articles since the early 1930s decrying the lower standards of pressing, and each year it gets worse. The problem had persisted for 4 decades and seemed farther than ever from a solution. Bill Starr observed that despite the harsh judgment on American lifters in Mexico, officials in local and regional meets were passing the same presses they let get by in 1968. A further premonition that stricter officiating was hardly here to stay was the poor refereeing at the 1969 European Championships in Leningrad. Then, at the World Championships in Warsaw, State witnessed an appalling decline in the standard of refereeing, the worst for years. He attributed it to the spinelessness of the jury. I watched aghast as knee kicks, jerk starts, laybacks were rewarded with white lights by the most permissive, ineffectual bunch of referees I have ever seen. Yet the jury sat there day after day and took no steps to stop the rot. They did once remonstrate with the 2 referees who passed Kuznetsov's shocking first press, but took no action to change them. When they did change 2 referees in the super heavyweight class, they removed 2 men who had honestly given red lights but had aroused the displeasure of the crowd, who booed and whistled for 6 minutes non-stop. It was fear of the crowd that prompted the jury in this case. Not surprisingly, pressing figures in 1969 posted a significant increase over the previous several years, and, more than ever, the lift appeared doomed. Presses continued to escalate at the 1970 and 1971 World Championships in Columbus, Ohio, and Lima, Peru, with ever more toleration of rules violations. The Olympic press, as Tommy Suggs rightly reckoned, isn't really a press any longer in the general sense of a press. It's a really hard drive and lockout. So much was it a quick lift that the presses of some of the heavyweights by this time were exceeding their clean and jerks. At Columbus, Russian super heavyweight Vasily Alexeyev made weightlifting history by becoming the first man to clean and jerk over 500 pounds. At Lima, he also pressed over 500 pounds. From a historical perspective, press gains over previous decades had been truly phenomenal. In 1936, German heavyweight Sepp Manger broke the 300-pound mark with a 303-pound press. It took nearly 20 years until Paul Anderson went over 400 pounds with a 402-pound press. This mark held until Yuri Vlasov made 408 pounds in 1962. It then took just 9 years, as a result of improved pressing techniques, for Alexev to clear 500 pounds. So out of control were the presses at Lima, observed Hoffman, that when the featherweights encountered a panel of strict officials, they simply did not know how to press. They were so accustomed to using unlimited knee kicks. Likewise, officials in the middleweight class were so conditioned to approving quick jerk presses with lots of knee kick that they were no longer capable of judging it as a strength lift. Slow, steady, correct presses were turned down throughout. The press, once the epitome of the strongman ideal that lay at the basis of modern weightlifting competition, was now reduced to a quid, and it was only a matter of time until it was no longer one of the Olympic lifts. The French, led by Jean Dame, had sought such a resolution through the 1960s. When Dame died in 1970, Oscar State, the powerful executive secretary of the FHI, became the chief exponent of abolition. Bulgarian coach Angel Spasov viewed State as a totalitarian. What the secretary wanted, he got. But a groundswell of opinion had been mounting against the press. Just prior to the 1972 Olympics, the United States Weightlifting Committee instructed its delegates, led by FHI President Johnson, to vote for the elimination of the press at the Congress. But the abolitionists were by no means confined to the West. Many socialist countries, influenced by doctors warning about the dangers of Olympic pressing techniques on the lower back, concurred. Such delegations as those from Brazil, Bulgaria, East Germany, the Philippines, Romania, Russia, and the United States favored elimination. Finally, acting on the recommendation of its technical committee at the Munich Olympics, the press was eliminated by a vote of 33 to 13. The decision was generally applauded. Webster viewed it as momentous and very necessary, believing officials and competitors alike would benefit in the long run. Hoffman called it a great idea, and Kono believed the sport will benefit. Even Alexev was 100% behind the Federation's new ruling. Strength and Health featured articles by leading American pressers in a series entitled Training Without the Press. These athletes agreed that the absence of the press would allow more time to practice and perfect the other lifts. Officials, coaches, and pundits, on the other hand, speculated more about its overall impact on weightlifting. State believed that lifters would become more athletic, more supple, fast, which will give our sport a more appealing and exciting image. Dropping the press would also enable promoters to make contests more appealing, in contrast to the long, drawn-out affairs that used to bore even the most enthusiastic spectator. Russian coach Vorobiev understood the necessity of retaining the press as a training exercise. When executed without traumatizing the midsection, it provided much-needed strength in the arm and upper shoulder girdle to hold heavy jerks and snatches. Most perceptive, perhaps, were the observations of writer D.L. Mott, who predicted a new, more functionally proportioned physique, in contrast to the classic broad shoulders, powerfully muscled look traditionally associated with weightlifters. Without the press, lifters would develop greater mobility in the joints and soon resemble track and field athletes in fitness and appearance. Most of these scenarios have been realized, but hardly to the long-run benefit of weightlifting, especially in America. While there are fewer officiating controversies and more streamlined competitions, athletes and spectators alike shifted their interest from Olympic lifting to powerlifting, bodybuilding, and strongman contests. What the delegates who abolished the press in 1972 failed to reckon was how much interest in weightlifting depended on traditional perceptions of strength and physique. Elimination of the press changed the image and appeal of the sport. Young men switched to powerlifting, which was more a test of sheer strength. Guys wanted to be big. Indeed, the demise of the press also coincided with a sudden surge of bodybuilding popularized in the 1970s by Arnold Schwarzenegger and Weider Enterprises. These changes obviously had a much greater impact in the free market West than in the state-controlled Eastern programs, which were better able to sustain a dying sport. It was obvious, at least to one correspondent to the Weightlifters newsletter in 1987, that the military press was the best means to restore the strength component to weightlifting. Most strong young men were not interested in the technique needed to master the quick lifts. The decline of the sport can be directly traced to 1972 and the elimination of the press. Strength will attract new lifters and not technique. Most poignant in identifying the operative human ingredient in weightlifting's decline were the remarks of Norwegian light heavyweight Leif Jensen, an outstanding presser who won a gold medal at Munich. He implored delegates, recalls Bob Christ, to keep the press. It was a sign of manliness. This attribute was likely an important consideration in the adoption of the press in 1928 as an Olympic and World Championship event. But even in Amsterdam, this lift, which epitomized manly strength, was becoming the center of political controversy, when the Germans, drawing on their tradition of continental pressing, gained an advantage. The French successfully retaliated at Los Angeles in 1932 by forsaking their military presses and adopting the looser German style. This lapse of standards, featuring a pronounced backbend, encouraged the Americans and British to abandon their strict ways and introduce rules that were more consistent with practice. Thus, the twin trends of loose pressing and lax officiating were well in place before the war and the entry of the Soviet Union into the international competition. Even after World War II, contrary to popular belief, the Russian press, a variation of pre-war pressing techniques, had virtually no impact on rising lifting totals for at least 5 years after its introduction by Gregory Novak in 1946. Thereafter, Russian victories were achieved more from their expertise in the quick lifts than the press. The notorious Russian press was more like a Cold War myth fostered by Western rivals to moralize about ill-gotten Soviet gains and political foul play. Even Webster admits that the Russians never claimed credit for it, attributing popularity of the backbending style to foreign lifters. What the Soviets did attempt was to use their influence over their Eastern European allies for ideological purposes to secure favorable decisions from officials and juries for at least a decade. But the Americans were not above employing politics to their advantage. Indeed, all nations must bear responsibility for the introduction of the body heave and knee kick in the late 1950s, resulting in a precipitate decline of pressing standards. The appearance of Japan and the Soviet satellites as weightlifting powers in the early 1960s partially depoliticized the press, but it was no less vulnerable to permissive officiating. Despite valiant efforts to apply strictness, all nations engaged in a free-for-all to capture the winning edge. By 1972, the press was clearly out of control, and abolition seemed the simplest solution. It's almost like losing an old friend, eulogized Bill Starr. The biggest difficulty I foresee in dropping the press is having to explain to everyone that asks the inevitable, how much can you press? Such was the displacement of Olympic lifting by its powerlifting and bodybuilding brethren by the end of the century that the new query became, how much can you bench? How much can you bench press?